Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning to celebrate the Americans with Disabilities Act. I want to first thank Secretary LaHood for your commitment and your willingness to bring me aboard and really begin to and continue to address many of the issues those of us in the disability community face in terms of transportation. I always say the number one thing that can make us independent to the fullest is transportation. If we can't get there, we can't go to school, we can't go to work, and we can't live independently. And so it's so very important that we take this task on in ensuring that transportation is accessible. I come to you, as many have said, from California. I was a special advisor to the Secretary for the California Emergency Management Agency, and we started an office called the Office for Access and Functional Needs. And we did that because we want emergency managers and planners to stop focusing on people with disabilities as being medical and start focusing on what are the real issues. Is things accessible? Do we have the ability to meet people's functional needs during a disaster and response? And I take many of those principles that I had with the California Emergency Management Agency and bring it here to the DOT in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. But I'm also relieved to say that it was clear by meeting with the executive team over the last couple of weeks that we're already heading in that direction. And we've already seen a lot of progress in terms of getting access and addressing the issues that we need to address. So for me, public transportation clearly was number one in terms of me being able to graduate from college and for me to be able to live independently and really have a successful career, because I've been very dependent on public transportation. You can only depend on your friends for so long. After a few rides, they're not going to be a taxi anymore, and they're very clear about that. And most of them don't have accessible vehicles either, so getting carried in and out of their vehicle isn't exactly the ideal thing that we all have. And so clearly for me, it's a priority that transportation be accessible, that the communications around it be accessible so that we all can benefit and so forth. So I have to tell you a story about my first day. It's a story about the sidewalk to nowhere. Some of you can relate. I was in a hurry. Although I knew how to get here on Metro, I'm never sure of myself, like yesterday when I got on the wrong train. So I got on the sidewalk and I'm heading to the Metro station, and I noticed that the sidewalk is getting narrow and narrow. And I thought, oh, this is not a good sign. And right about the time it got as wide as my wheelchair, I realized I wasn't getting off the curb. And I thought, this certainly lights the picture for me in terms of the responsibility and the role that the Federal Highway Administration has in ensuring that the rights of pathway are accessible. Because it's not enough for us just to be able to get on a bus or get on a train. We have to be able to get from point A to point B when we get off that train. And so many times I've gotten off a bus and said to myself, now how am I getting across that street to where I need to go? And so it's so very important, and that sidewalk to nowhere reminded me so much of what we're doing here at DOT and what we have to do to move forward in terms of addressing the issues. So really what I said to you earlier in terms of my role at Cal EMA is, and what we need to do here is move past looking at people with disabilities as medical and stop looking at needs as being special. We got away in California from referring to people's needs as special needs, because the needs aren't special. They're only special when we don't plan and we don't ensure that things are in place to meet people's functional needs. Now, what does that really mean, and how do we really get to that point? Well, let me share a couple ideas with you. First, I can get on any bus and I can get on any train car that I want to. Not the one that they've designated as being the only accessible car, but any bus or car. I can get off of any sidewalk and I can cross any street. That's really what being accessible is about. No matter what piece of equipment I am using, whether it's a wheelchair, whether it's crutches, whether it's canes, or whether it's somebody pushing a baby stroller, I should be able to do those things. Secondly, I can access an airplane. And get in the restrooms on the airplane. Oh, and most importantly, when I get off the plane, my equipment's going to be in one piece. That's so very important. My friends in California told me they're going to measure my effectiveness in this job by whether or not they can actually ride in their wheelchair on an airplane. And they say, I can ride a train in my wheelchair. I can ride on a bus in my wheelchair. I can go on a boat in my wheelchair. but I can't ride on a plane in my wheelchair. I told them my goal was to get in the bathroom, but we'd work on that part too, which they agreed. Also, I can access cruise ships and benefit from the same services that all the other patrons are benefiting from. It's so very important that we be able to have the pleasures and the fun like anyone else wants to do, because we need to get away and relax and have a good time also. Also, the communication will be effective in the different modes of transportation. In the stations, whether it's a train station, whether it's an airport, we have to be sure that people can communicate. Whether you're a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, whether you're a person who's blind or low vision, whether you're both blind and deaf, or whether English isn't your primary language. It's so very important that the communication be effective to those individuals so that, number one, they can effectively use the service, and number two, not be like me and get lost every time they get on the metro. And lastly, which I think is so very important, which we haven't spent a lot of time on, but it's around disasters. I think it's really important that disability and aging transportation providers be a part of and be integrated into emergency planning and response and the recovery process. We've talked about it a lot over the years, but it's not been necessarily a priority to require it. What does that mean? That means that they also are part of the exercises, part of the drills. It needs to be integrated fully. What we need to get away from is that people with disabilities have to put themselves on databases or registries to get evacuation services, because the evacuation services should already be accessible, meaning the accessible vehicles should be a part of first responders' response during an evacuation. That there are accessible vehicles at shelters, because when you get to a shelter, you just don't stay there all the time if you're going to be there for any long period of time, but that you'd be able to be transported from one location to another, regardless of whether you're not in a shelter. So you can see that there are a lot of areas that I want to focus on and that I want to think about. I know many of you here at DOT and all of our partners have already been focusing on those areas, and I just hope that I can bring some of those expertise. In closing, I wanted to say that I've been very impressed with FTA's enforcement and the reviews that they've been doing over the last couple years. It's so critical. We all know that history has proven that the commitment to enforcement leads to the strength of any civil rights law. When you're not committed to enforcement, the law does not have the strength that it needs to address the needs of individuals. So I just want to say I'm very impressed, and I hope we continue on in working with FTA to ensure that we're doing the enforcement that we need to ensure that individuals are having accessible transportation and communication during their service. So the lessons documented and acted upon have brought us many good, positive roads, but there is much more to do. And I want to say that I come to DOT with only one goal, and that is that access and functional needs is integrated into everything that we do. And it's no longer a question, and it's no longer seen as special, but it's just what we do. Thank you.